Hi and welcome back to the channel. Someone found my hat offensive last time around, the Hillsong hat, which is a parody hat based on Hillsong Church. So I apologise for Australia inflicting Hillsong on the world. I'm not going to stop wearing the hat. I like it. If people don't have a problem with it, they have a problem with it. But anyway, let's get that out of the way and talk about movies. I've got two circus-based English horror movies for you this time around, and one movie which isn't in a circus but is a bit of a hidden gem. So stick around for that. The other thing is, I got a post-pandemic haircut. Yes, I was able to. So my hair does not any longer look like Rick Sanchez. And there's other good news as well. On Friday, I am going to see Shang-Chi at the cinema because cinemas reopened Friday evening. And I'm at the first session of my local cinema to see that. I got my tickets booked for the James Bond film. I've sneakily already seen Dune. So yeah, things are going back to a version of normal. And I'm quite pleased about that. But on with the movies. All three of the movies are by different British film studios. The first one's from Anglo Amalgamated, which I really like the logo for. The second one is from our old friends at Hammer. And the third one is from Hammer's red-headed stepbrother, Amicus Films. They're all horror. They're not horrible. They're not kind of martyrs type horror. But they're all of their time. They're all considered to be classics of a sort now. And for me, I liked them because when I first saw them, I was much more innocent. I hadn't seen two Human Centipede movies. I hadn't seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you kind of get attuned to horror to a certain degree. And at that stage, in the 60s and 70s when I saw these films, the idea of what scared us was very much different and very much less hideous and confronting than the things that scare horror movie fans in the 21st century. So just bear that in mind while I talk about the films. The first one's from 1960 and it's a classic, Circus of Horrors, directed by Sidney Hayers and starring the wonderful Anton Diffring, Conrad Phillips and Donald Pleasance. Now this one is a movie that I've seen a number of times and I like. It's very much an exploitation film of its time and the story is kind of cool, and probably owes just the tiniest bit to Georges Franju's Yeux sans visage. But leaving that aside, we've got 1947 England. There's a car racing through the countryside with three people in it. There's Dr. Rossiter and his two assistants who are running away because he's done an illegal plastic surgery operation on a woman with a facial disfigurement, and the operation has gone wrong, partly because the patient took the bandages off early and partly because Rossiter screwed up. We kind of cross-cut between the woman and Rossiter and his gang running away. They've decided that they're going to go to France and go to the continent and basically stay one step ahead of the law, and they indeed do that. While they're making that plan, we see the disfigurement of the woman upon whom Dr. Rossiter has operated. Rossiter decides to change his name to Schuler, and they're travelling through the French countryside looking for a town, and they come upon a young girl pumping water out of a well. She's about 10 years old, and she has facial scarring from the war. And they meet the girl's father, played by Donald Pleasance, who runs a really run-down little circus, Circus Vanet. His name is Vanet. And he's an alcoholic, but he loves his daughter, and he loves his circus. So Schuler/Rossiter offers to operate on the daughter in return for a half share of the circus. The operation is successful, and to celebrate the success of the operation, Vanet gets extra drunk, dances with his performing bear, and accidentally gets squashed to death by the bear. So Schuler's running the whole circus, he adopts the young girl, and we cut to 10 years later. The circus, now renamed Circus Schuler, is being run by Shula and his cronies, and he has populated the performers with women who had facial disfigurements, are extremely beautiful, and he teaches them how to do circus acts. So basically he's got a whole bunch of beautiful female criminals to run his circus with, apart from all of the dwarves and elephant trainers and lion tamers and trapeze artists and all the other people in there. But his star attractions are all women who had previously had disfigurement and whom Shula has mended. Now, we could go into a whole argument about how bad people are portrayed in movies as having some form of deformity or physical disability, and that also plays into one of the other movies I'm going to talk about. But this one I like a lot. A police investigation starts because the Shula Circus is known as the Jinx Circus because a whole bunch of performers die under mysterious circumstances. Basically, they're the women that Shula has healed, and if they want to leave for any reason, Shula has a tendency to make sure that they don't. The movie was filmed in cooperation with the Billy Smart Circus in England, so you see a lot of genuine circus performers. You see some really nice acrobats, you see some nice trapeze artists, you see a clown troupe, you see lion taming, and they actually use a lot of the infrastructure of the circus as the setting for the story. They also have a song called Look for a Star, which is played while the circus acts are performing. It was written by Tony Hatch under a pseudonym of Mark Anthony, and as the movie progresses, this kind of facile little pop song becomes a warning that somebody is going to die in a really gory way. Someone's going to be eaten by lions, or somebody is going to be stabbed in the neck during a knife throwing act, or a woman's going to fall off a rope. So there's all of these things that occur with the women who Shula has a falling out with, and this little cute tune keeps playing every time it's going to happen. So it's a bit like a William Castle warning at the start of anything gory that's going to happen. And I kind of like that. It's a nice little conceit. Look for a star. Anton Diffring, who had a Jewish father and had left Germany before the war, had that curse of playing Nazis and various bad guys during his career, but he was a gifted actor. Apparently in real life he was a very nice guy as well. He was gay, and so he would have been persecuted by the Germans even if he had not been half Jewish. And he did a whole bunch of really interesting horror films. He did things like The Man Who Could Cheat Death. He did some episodes of Doctor Who in the 70s as well. But I always liked Anton Diffring because he had the look of a really evil Nazi, even though he was nothing like that in real life. So he's in there, he's really good. The two assistants who help him out are played by Jane Hilton and Kenneth Griffith. And they've got their own backstory, and they've got their own arc during the film. Conrad Phillips, who plays the undercover police detective, people might have known because a couple of years before this movie, he played William Tell in a TV series that played here in Australia for a very long time. And then you've got all the beautiful women. You've got Yvonne Malua, Erica Remberg, Vanda Hudson, and Yvonne Romaine. And there's a prurience about the whole movie too, because most of the female characters, with one exception being Jane Hilton's character, you see in various states of undress at various times during the movie. You don't get full nudity, but you get kind of titillating nudity of the style that was popular with certain audiences in the 1960s. And so there's a prurience about it. Even at the start where you see the society lady with the disfigurement, you see her in bra and panties for no particular reason apart from the male gaze. But Circus of Horrors is a lot of fun, and it tells a story kind of blending the usual circus horror kind of themes with that plastic surgery subplot. And you see things like Shula prodding a gorilla, which is clearly a guy in a gorilla suit, because for some reason he doesn't like the gorilla. And that then has a comeuppance later in the film. And the climax of the film is a kind of left field revenge by one of Shula's victims. It's a lot of fun, this movie, and if you haven't seen it, you really should. It's very much of its time, but it's very, very entertaining, and that constant motif of look for a star. Look for a star. all through the gory deaths that occur during the film, makes it just that little bit sweeter. So that's the first of the circus films.
Look for a star.
For the second one, we've got to move 13 years ahead. And 1973 is a very different time than 1960, particularly in the UK. Hammer had been doing vampire movies for a while, but this one has a bit of a difference to it. It doesn't have Dracula in it at all. It has a different count. It doesn't have Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee in it. It doesn't even have Michael Ripper. But I think it's a little bit of a hidden gem amongst Hammer's vampire output, and that is Vampire Circus from 1973. Now, Vampire Circus has a good start, where a young girl's out in the forest with her father who's cutting wood, and she's kind of lured away by a beautiful young woman who takes her to the castle where the Count, who is a vampire, decides he needs to drink the blood of this child. And there's a really creepy scene for a number of different reasons, where the vampire kind of undoes the little girl's plaits and then bites her in the neck while the woman watches it. And it's quite clear that the woman is being turned on by the vampire feeding on this child. And that's the next level twisted. And then the vampire says to her, one lust feeds the other.
One lust feeds the other.
And then they have a roll in the hay while the dead child's in the room. And you get some nudity in there. You definitely get some
Busty substances.
Now, the young woman's played by Domina Blythe, who went on to have a long career in Canadian theatre, doing a lot of Shakespeare and other things. So people start out strangely in their careers on the screen and in stage work. And this was Domina Blythe's start of her career. The villagers are really cheesed off because their children are getting taken and killed by the vampire. They attack using torches and wooden stakes, and skewer the vampire and beat the woman up with leather belts until her husband intercedes and she flees into the forest. Now, just before he dies, the vampire tells her to go and find his cousin Emile in the Circus of Nights, and that's where the circus comes in. We cut to 15 years later, and the Circus of Nights enters the village just as a plague is inflicting the village, and the outside world, or the country around them, has isolated the village in quarantine. Anybody who tries to leave the village gets shot by the authorities, which is a theme that we can kind of appreciate a little bit differently these days. The circus is run by a woman played by Adrienne Corey, who you might remember was the woman who gets attacked by the Droogs in Clockwork Orange, the one with the red jumpsuit. That's Adrienne Corey. And in this one, she gets a very nuanced role. I think she's really good in this film. The circus has a whole bunch of different acts in it, including a strong man played by David Prowse, who went on to do other things later on in that decade. You've got Skip Martin playing a clown who is just a figure with a little bit of an edge. You get a were-panther character who's also a vampire. And you get boy and girl twins. The female twin is played by Lala Ward, who went on to marry Tom Baker and also be in Doctor Who as one of his companions later on in that decade. The town burgomaster is played by Thorley Walter, who is an interesting character actor and is a kind of avuncular presence and does the horror aspects of this really well. One of the things the circus has is a corridor of mirrors, which is used by the vampires to lure people in. The vampires in this movie have very different powers than the other vampires you see in Hammer horror films. They have more magical powers and more kind of oblique powers than most vampires have. And that kind of works well. The movie isn't as good as you want it to be in some ways, because you want to learn more about the circus and how the circus works as the movie progresses. But it was filmed on a fairly low budget over a fairly short time span, and the director was fairly new at his gig. It was his first professional feature film directing role, and he was going over time, and the bosses at Hammer kind of cut short the production, so certain things weren't done, and they patched together the latter half of the film in the edit. But for me it works. There's a kind of tiger lady who's
Busty substances.
clad in mostly body paint, which is quite an interesting thing to see in any horror film, particularly in the 1970s. So there's a lot of nudity in this one, and there's a lot of kind of prurience. And that works well, except for the fact that part of the audience watching the circus do all these things is children. As far as building an atmosphere, as far as giving us vampires in a different context than the Karnstein trilogy that Hammer did, or any of the Christopher Lee Dracula ones, I think that the Vampire Circus works quite well. It really is a little bit of a, I'm not going to say hidden gem, but it's a little bit off to one side of the vampire mythos as given to us by Hammer. And that really works for me. I think it's a valid way of doing it. I think having a character actor as strong as Adrienne Corey holding the circus part of it together, she really gives her all to this particular role. And Thorley Walter's always fun in there as well. And the younger actors are quite effective as well. There's John Mulder Brown playing one of the villagers whose girlfriend is threatened by the vampires. And there are some really interesting and good vampire deaths in this one. So Vampire Circus you should check out. It's not something you should watch when the kids are around, unless the kids are in their 20s. I first saw this one back in the day in the cinema, but the Australian authorities for some reason cut out a lot of the nudity, which was disappointing to me as a teenage boy. But seeing a more complete version of it now, I can see the whole vision. And it's a nice blending of eroticism with horror. And even though it's not a perfect vampire movie, and it's not even the top level of Hammer horror films, it's still an honest horror movie, and very much one that I appreciate. The third movie is one that I saw on a Saturday matinee when I was a kid. And it shouldn't have been shown to children on a Saturday matinee, but my local cinema, the Regal in Liverpool, New South Wales, was prone to just chuck anything they could get at a Saturday matinee double feature. And so they threw this one at an audience of children. The Psychopath from 1966, made by Amicus Films, starring Patrick Wymark, Margaret Johnston, Alexander Knox and John Standing. Troy Howarth, who did the commentary track on the Kino Lorber Blu-ray of this one, made an interesting point that it plays like an English giallo movie, like an Italian giallo movie. In fact, it was very popular when it was shown in Italy, which leads me to believe that they knew what kind of film this was. And there are some little bits of business in there that very much are reminiscent of Mario Bava's giallo output at the time. The story is fairly simple. A bunch of men keep getting killed in mysterious ways, and dolls that look exactly like those men are left behind. By the way, and I'm jumping around a little bit here, directed by Freddie Francis from a script by Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch does hit a few plot beats from Psycho in this one, but then he wrote it. But it's still an interesting film, and it's got a climax that's always stayed with me as one of the moments in a horror film that I really like. So the police investigate, and the police inspector Holloway is played by Patrick Wymark, who people might remember from Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. He was the main investigator into Roy Thinnis' Astronaut in that film. Really solid character actor. Died unfortunately very early of a heart attack while he was in Sydney, Australia, doing Sleuth the play. And unfortunately he died in his hotel room not too long into the 1970s. But Patrick Wymark's Inspector Holloway is really good. Working class copper, and there are a few little bits of kind of class consciousness in this movie as well, as far as Holloway interacting with people of a higher social standing than himself, which makes for a really interesting character. The character is much better than the movie in some ways. So eventually Inspector Holloway is led to Mrs. Von Sturm, played by Margaret Johnston, who oddly enough was born in Sydney, Australia, who is a woman in a wheelchair of German background. Her family fell on hard times when her husband was seen to be using slave labour during the war in his doll factory. And so he committed suicide, and his wife and her young son moved to England. Now, Mrs. von Sturm, you've got that thing again with somebody with a disability being evil. But hopefully we can move on from that in the future. I don't think it's really valid. I want to see able-bodied evil people going up against people who have a disability. Kind of wait until dark kind of stuff is going to be more prevalent in the future, I think. But anyway, so Mrs. von Sturm in a wheelchair is deeply creepy, apart from the fact that she has a house full of dolls, which will be very difficult to maneuver a wheelchair around, but she somehow manages. And his son, Mark, played by John Standing, is kind of creepy too. He's a little bit kind of shy and a little bit pasty-faced, and he's very much under the thumb of his mother in a slightly Norman Bates kind of way. There's also, of course, you've got to have ingenues and these kind of things. So for the female ingenue, you've got Judy Huxtable, who was in a really interesting movie called The Touchables, and she's quite good in the film. She essays the character quite well and handles the horror stuff really, really well. I think that she should have had a better and a more fulfilling career than she did, because I think she definitely had the talent and the dedication to the craft of acting that would have given her a much longer career had she chosen to do so. Instead, she married Peter Cook.
Dusty substances.
So more and more of these guys keep getting knocked off, and we find out that they've got an association to Mrs. von Sturm. So there's not too much of an investigation needs to be done here. And we get some grotesque deaths. We get Thorley Walter again in the movie, playing one of the men who is being killed by the mysterious, though not very mysterious, killers. He gets done in with a blowtorch. Another guy who's a modern artist gets hung. One guy gets his legs crushed and his body crushed by a car. So they're kind of picking and choosing a whole bunch of different deaths for these people, all of which involve having a doll left beside them, which for murderers is kind of self-defeating, because you're going to be found out. You don't deliberately leave clues in anything except a movie. In real life, Jack the Ripper's had too much of an influence there. Leaving bits of liver and leaving notes for the coppers was never a good move if you wanted to have a long career as a killer. So Inspector Holloway tracks things down, and tracks down Mrs. von Sturm and Mark. Mark, who also helps his mother with the dolls, works in a boatyard, and there's a confrontation between Inspector Holloway and Mark in a boatyard, which ends up in a very grisly kind of way. But then there's a coda where the young woman, played by Judy Huxtable, is threatened by Mrs. von Sturm, and that leads to a climax, which is very disturbing, and at the time I remember it freaked me the hell out. It was really creepy to me, the last bit of this movie, and I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's just messed up in a 1960s kind of way. But I like it. I like Patrick Wymark in the movie. I like Margaret Johnston playing the Mrs. von Sturm character. She has a creepiness about her that really works. And John Standing as her son has that kind of shy creepiness about him that really sends up red flags to everybody who meets the character. It's a really nice little thriller. I don't think it's perfect. I think that there was a whole bunch of problems with the production of the film, mostly to do with them needing to put in extra material to increase the length of the film. The script was quite short. They wanted to make it about 83 minutes. And so there are little character bits for each of the victims, which wouldn't technically be necessary had the film been fleshed out a little more in the script phase, but it wasn't. And nonetheless, for a low-budget Amicus film, it's still got a certain wonderfulness about it. Now, the Kino Lorber Blu-ray is the only time, apart from a German DVD release, when this has been released on modern media. The first reel or so of the transfer we've got from Kino Lorber does have some lines coming down the screen, but the later reels seem to be free of that kind of a problem. Nonetheless, if you're interested in horror films, you really should check out The Psychopath. Find a copy of it, give it a go. It's a nice little kind of pommy giallo movie, which worked for me, and because I've got that long association with it, it's just got that little extra resonance to it. So that's it for this time around. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/paleocinema. I think before sometime in November I really want to do a live stream again. So let me know what you'd like to see in a live stream if I do a live stream for 2 hours one day. And I've got a few ideas for the rest of the month which should keep us busy. Now when I say the rest of the month, it's the 26th now, so yeah, it'll be one more video probably. But for the Saturday video I've got a few ideas. It'll be a lot of fun. So anyway, look after yourselves, stay safe, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some English circus horror movies, and I'll catch you next time.